Good morning, first grade, and welcome back to Bible. Today's story is entitled Esther Becomes Queen. And today we're going to talk about how God has a plan for our lives, even when we don't understand. And our memory verse is taken from Esther chapter 4, verse 14. Who knows? You may have been chosen queen for just such a time as this. It was a hot evening, and Hadassah pushed off her hair off her forehead as she climbed the steps to the roof. Cousin Mordecai was sitting on the roof, his elbows and his knees gazing northwest, as he often did. Hadassah knew that Jerusalem lay in that direction, over the mountains, far from Persia. She sat down quietly on the rooftop beside Mordecai's feet and leaned against his knee. I wonder what it's like in Jerusalem, Mordecai said. My grandfather Shimei used to tell me stories of the land of our fathers. He remembered being taken captive with his father Kish when King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians captured the country. He said they burned all the important cities. Hadassah had heard these stories many times in the years since her parents had died, and cousin Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter, but she never grew tired of listening. It was a mighty kingdom when the power of God was there, Mordecai said. I used to listen to the hour to the stories of the golden age of Israel under King David and his son Solomon, who built the great temple. But when new kings came to power, the people began to worship idols. Time after time, they were taken captive by the countries whose gods they worshiped. Then they would turn back to God for forgiveness and rescue. God would help them, and for a while, they would worship him. But kings grew more and more wicked, and the people couldn't seem to stay away from the idols. Finally, the prophets, especially Jeremiah, said that God's patience was running out. If the people did not truly repent in their hearts, God would send them into captivity that would cure them once and for all. Mordecai sighed and fell silent. That was when King Nebuchadnezzar took the people captive, Hadassah said. Yes, Mordecai said, and the prophets said it was no use asking God to rescue us at that time. We were to build homes and pray for the welfare of the country we live in now. For 70 years we would live in captivity, and I must say I don't believe we Jews will ever worship idols again. We've spent too many years weeping over our lost homeland and temple. But the 70 years are now over. Many people have gone back to resettle the land and to rebuild the temple. Cousin Mordecai, Hadassah said, do you think we'll ever go there? I don't know. I believe God still needs us here, still. Because your job as a palace official is important? Hadassah asked. Oh, I don't know if that's the reason. I just feel we are needed here. Or maybe it's just that I'm too old for the long, hard journey and the struggle to rebuild there. Hadassah watched Mordecai's face. He had been a good father to her, and she loved him and respected him. He had taught her of the heritage and that the God of heaven was her God, no matter where she lived. If God had a plan for them here in Persia, then this is where they would stay. Come, she said, tugging at his arm. Time for bed. The king may send for you early tomorrow. At least that's an awful party. It finally is over. Only King Xerxes would have a party that lasted 6 months. Mordecai smiled. He had to show all the princes how mighty and powerful he was so that they would be obedient. Hadassah frowned, remembering, well, he wasn't powerful enough to force Queen Vashti to appear before a lot of drunken princesses. I cannot understand why the king would punish Vashti by not allowing her to be queen any longer just because she would not obey him. The next day, Mordecai came home to tell Hadassah of a new decree. The king had declared that he is looking for a new queen. He has sent officers to the 127 provinces to gather all the beautiful maidens for him to choose from. Do you know what that means, Hadassah? You will be taken from me. I wish we had gone to Israel after all. Hadassah felt nervous when she heard the news, but she said as calmly as she could, did you not say you feel God has a plan for us? Surely we can trust him to work things out for the best. You are right, my child, but I think you had better not let them know yet that you are a Jew. Why don't you go by your Persian name, Esther? Hadassah agreed, and when they went to the place where the maidens were to be gathered, she was one of the first ones chosen. Never before had Mordecai wished she were not so beautiful. What would become of her now? He was glad that his palace job gave him the right to be in the palace compound. Every day he went anxiously to the court of the women to get news of Hadassah, that is, Esther. The news was reassuring. Haggai, the man who took care of the women, was very impressed with Esther. Some of the women were proud and haughty, as they were already the next queen. Some were frightened and kept crying for their homes and families, but Esther was calm and dignified, not expecting special treatment. She might be frightened inside, but she had no intention of showing that to anyone except God. Soon she found herself in the best part of the house of women, with 7 of the best maids and special food and ointments. She sent messages to Mordecai. "Don't worry, God is caring for me, just as you always said he would." Every day the women had special beauty treatments and lessons on the rules of court and how to act around the king. For instance, no one must ever enter into the presence of the king unless he sent for her. Anyone who disobeyed, even the queen, would be killed, unless the king held out his scepter, sparing her life. Trying to see the king without an invitation wasn't worth taking the risk, and Esther had no intention of trying it. Months passed. Sometimes musicians or dancers entertained the women, but mostly life was pretty boring. Petty jealousies existed and arguments broke out, frequently among the women. Esther tried to make friends and to be helpful. 6 months of oil and myrrh, 6 months with other spices and ointments. Surely there was more to life. At last the time came for each woman to have her turn to go before the king. Esther felt frightened all over again. She prayed even more and more and kept reminding herself that God had his own plans and she must not be afraid. The day came when it was her turn. Esther had never wanted so badly to run back to cousin Mordecai and hide, but she stood patiently. With her maids anointed her and rubbed lotion into her skin and dressed her in special robes made just for this day and fixed her hair just so. She whispered to herself, "God will never leave me nor forsake me. Surely this is easier than what Joseph went through." The rich hangings of the king's throne room were swept aside for Esther to enter. Esther couldn't look up. She found herself counting the tiles on the mosaic floor. Marble, mother of pearl, and precious gems passed under her feet as she slowly walked toward the king's throne. At last she stopped and looked up. There he was, the ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever known, King Xerxes. He was smiling. Esther smiled back. That day she talked with the king, answering his questions, walked with him, and she ate with him. The next day, she was told she was the next queen. She had never expected this. Was this God's plan? So again, today our memory verse comes from Esther chapter 4, verse 14. Who knows? You may have been chosen queen for such a time as this.